My name is Catherine Walsh. I'm 64 years old, and I thought giving my son $500,000 for his dream wedding would be the greatest gift of my life. Instead, it became the most expensive lesson I ever learned about the man I raised. When I caught him kissing another woman 3 days before walking down the aisle, I didn't just freeze his heart, I froze every penny he thought was his.
Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're a subscriber, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Tell us a duh.
For 37 years, I believed I knew exactly who my son was. Thomas Walsh, Tommy to me, was supposed to be everything his father and I had dreamed of raising. Smart, ambitious, charming, with a law degree from Columbia and a smile that could convince anyone of anything. He was our golden boy, our success story, our proof that hard work and sacrifice could create something beautiful. I'm Catherine Walsh, 64 years old, and until 3 months ago, I was planning to give my only child the wedding of a lifetime. Not because he asked for it, Tommy was too proud for that, but because I wanted to. Because after losing my husband Richard to cancer 4 years ago, watching my son find love felt like watching hope return to our family. The woman he was marrying seemed perfect for him. Jennifer Morrison, Jen, was a pediatric nurse from a good family in Connecticut. Sweet, intelligent, genuinely kind in a way that reminded me of myself at her age. When Tommy brought her home for the first time 2 years ago, she helped me clear the dinner dishes without being asked and spent an hour looking through photo albums of Tommy as a baby, laughing at all the right moments. She was everything I had hoped my son would find. But what Tommy didn't know, what nobody knew, was that his modest middle-class mother had been sitting on a fortune that would have shocked him to his core. Richard and I had lived simply our entire marriage. We drove used cars, lived in the same modest house in Westchester for 30 years, and rarely took vacations. To everyone who knew us, including Tommy, we were comfortable but certainly not wealthy. A retired high school principal and a part-time bookkeeper don't typically accumulate vast wealth, and we made sure it looked that way. The truth was far different. Richard had inherited family money that we never touched, never mentioned, and never used for anything except careful, conservative investments. His grandfather had been one of the early investors in what became IBM, and Richard's father had been smart enough never to sell those shares. By the time the money came to Richard, it had grown into something substantial. By the time Richard died, careful management had turned it into something extraordinary. $7.2 million in carefully diversified investments, real estate holdings, and trust funds that existed completely outside our visible life. Money that Tommy had never seen evidence of, never suspected existed, and certainly never expected to inherit. When Richard died, he left everything to me, with one specific instruction written in his will. Use this to make sure Tommy has every opportunity in life, but make sure he earns his character before he inherits his comfort. I had spent 4 years trying to figure out what that meant. Tommy seemed to have turned out well. Successful career, stable relationship, responsible adult behavior. The wedding felt like the perfect opportunity to give him something extraordinary, while celebrating what appeared to be excellent judgment in choosing a life partner. $500,000 was less than 7% of what I actually had, but it represented everything Tommy and Jennifer had dreamed of for their wedding. The venue they'd fallen in love with but couldn't afford, a historic estate in the Hudson Valley with gardens that overlooked the river. The photographer whose work Jennifer had admired in magazines, but whose price tag was far beyond their budget. The flowers, the music, the catering that would make their day perfect. I had planned to surprise them with all of it. For months, I had been secretly coordinating with vendors, putting deposits down with my own credit cards, and arranging for what would appear to be a series of miraculous last-minute deals and unexpected discounts that would make their dream wedding suddenly affordable. Tommy thought his mother was contributing a modest amount, maybe $10,000 towards flowers and music. He had no idea that the woman he still saw as his financially struggling widowed mother was quietly funding an event that would rival anything featured in the society pages. The irony wasn't lost on me that I was being so secretive about helping him, but Richard's words echoed in my mind constantly. Character before comfort. I wanted to see who Tommy really was when he thought no one was watching, when he believed he was responsible for creating his own happiness, when he thought his choices mattered because he alone would live with the consequences. For 2 years of watching him with Jennifer, I had been proud of what I saw. He was attentive, respectful, hardworking. He had saved diligently for a ring he could barely afford and proposed in a quiet moment in our family garden rather than staging some elaborate public display. He had chosen a woman based on her character rather than her bank account, and he treated her with the kind of steady devotion that reminded me of Richard in our early years. I was so sure I had raised a good man, so confident that the son I was about to surprise with an extraordinary gift was worthy of the trust I was placing in him, so certain that the wedding I was funding would be the beginning of a life that would make both Richard and me proud. I was preparing to reward character I was convinced I had witnessed, not realizing I was about to discover character I had never suspected existed. The first hint that something was wrong came not from anything I saw, but from something I felt. A mother's intuition that nagged at me in quiet moments. A sense that the man I thought I knew completely was somehow a stranger I was still meeting. The story of how Tommy became the center of my universe begins with the worst day of my life, the day his father was diagnosed with pancreatic cancer. Tommy was 33 then, just starting to make partner at his law firm, building what looked like a successful, independent life in Manhattan. Richard and I had been so proud of how self-sufficient he'd become, how he'd never asked us for money after college, how he seemed to have inherited Richard's work ethic and integrity. When the doctors told us Richard had maybe 6 months, Tommy immediately offered to move back home to help with caregiving. He took a leave of absence from work, converted his childhood bedroom into a makeshift office, and spent Richard's final 8 months making sure his father never felt alone or afraid. I watched my adult son read to his dying father every evening, help him with medications, and maintain Richard's dignity even when the cancer stripped away everything else. During those months, I fell in love with my son all over again. Not as the baby I'd raised or the successful adult I'd launched, but as the man he'd chosen to become. When Richard was having bad days, Tommy would sit beside his bed and tell him stories about the cases he was working on, the apartment he was fixing up, the woman he'd started dating who made him think about settling down. Richard would listen with eyes that sparkled despite his pain, so proud of the man we'd raised together. Catherine, Richard whispered to me one night after Tommy had fallen asleep in the chair beside his bed, we did something right with that boy. Whatever mistakes we made, we got the important things right. Those words sustained me through Richard's death and the terrible emptiness that followed. Tommy stayed for 3 weeks after the funeral, helping me navigate paperwork, insurance claims, and the 1,000 practical details that death leaves behind. He was patient with my grief, understanding about my confusion, and gentle in ways that reminded me so much of his father. When he finally returned to his life in the city, I felt truly alone for the first time in my marriage. But I also felt proud. Whatever challenges lay ahead, I knew I had raised a son who would be there when it mattered. A son who understood love as action, not just words. The house felt enormous without Richard's presence and Tommy's temporary return to it. I wandered through rooms that suddenly seemed pointless. Why did we need a formal dining room when I ate cereal standing at the kitchen counter? Why had we kept Tommy's room exactly as he'd left it when he was 18, like a shrine to a childhood that was decades past? That's when I started thinking about the money Richard had left me. $7.2 million, sitting in accounts I barely understood, managed by a financial advisor Richard had trusted, but I'd never met. Money that felt more like Richard's ghost than my inheritance. Present, but not quite real. Significant, but not quite mine. I met with the financial advisor, a serious woman named Patricia Hendricks, who had been managing Richard's family money for 15 years. She explained the portfolio with the same patience Tommy had shown while teaching Richard to use his smartphone during chemo treatments. Conservative investments, she said, blue chip stocks, municipal bonds, real estate investment trusts. Nothing flashy, nothing risky, just steady growth that had compounded for decades.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
Your husband was very clear about his wishes, Patricia told me during our first meeting. He wanted the money to provide security for you and opportunity for Tommy, but he was specific about not wanting it to change either of you. He said wealth should enhance character, not replace it. That phrase stuck with me. Wealth should enhance character, not replace it. Richard had grown up with money, but had chosen to live as if he hadn't, specifically because he'd seen what inherited wealth had done to some of his cousins. Entitled behavior, lack of initiative, relationships based on financial advantage rather than genuine connection. He'd been determined that Tommy would develop his own sense of worth before learning about his eventual inheritance. Over the next 2 years, I watched Tommy build his life with Jennifer with genuine happiness. They moved in together, splitting rent on a small apartment near Central Park. They saved for vacations, argued about grocery budgets, and celebrated small financial victories like finally being able to afford decent furniture. It was exactly the kind of normal young adult struggle that Richard had wanted Tommy to experience. When Tommy brought Jennifer home for holidays, I saw how they treated each other. She would tease him about his terrible cooking, and he would massage her feet after her 12-hour shifts at the hospital. They talked about their shared future with the careful planning of people who knew they had to build their security themselves. They were saving for an engagement ring, researching affordable wedding venues, discussing whether they could afford to start a family within the next 5 years. It was beautiful to watch, two people who loved each other creating a life based on their own efforts and choices. Jennifer would ask my advice about dealing with difficult patients, and Tommy would help me understand new technology or fix things around the house. They felt like the family Richard and I had always hoped we'd have, close but not dependent, loving but not suffocating.
The engagement came exactly as I'd expected it would. Tommy proposed on a quiet Sunday morning in Jennifer's apartment, with a ring he'd saved for 8 months to afford. Jennifer called me crying with happiness, and Tommy's voice shook with emotion when he asked if I approved of his choice, as if there had ever been any question. "Your father would have loved her," I told him, and watched his eyes fill with tears. "And he would have been so proud of the man you've become." That's when they started talking about the wedding they wanted but couldn't afford, the venue that cost 3 times their budget, the photographer whose work Jennifer had admired in magazines, the flowers, the music, the celebration that would mark the beginning of their real adult life together. And that's when I started planning the surprise that I thought would be the perfect expression of a mother's love. The wedding planning began innocently enough, or so I thought at the time. Tommy and Jennifer had set a date, June 15th, exactly 2 years after their engagement, and immediately started the overwhelming process of trying to create their dream wedding on their combined income of roughly $90,000 a year. I watched them spread venue brochures across my kitchen table during Sunday dinners, their faces falling as they calculated costs. The historic Riverside Manor they'd fallen in love with cost $12,000 just for the venue rental. The photographer whose portfolio made Jennifer's eyes light up charged $8,000 for a wedding package. The florist they consulted quoted $6,000 for the arrangements Jennifer had envisioned. "Maybe we should just do something simple," Jennifer said one evening, her voice trying to sound cheerful while her disappointment was obvious. "A small ceremony at the church, reception in the parish hall. It's about the marriage, not the wedding, right?" Tommy's jaw was tight as he nodded agreement, but I could see the defeat in his posture. These were two people who worked hard, lived responsibly, and had never asked anyone for financial help. The fact that their modest savings couldn't create the celebration they wanted wasn't a reflection of poor planning. It was simply the mathematics of young adult life in an expensive world. That's when I made my first intervention, small and carefully disguised. "You know," I said casually, "my friend Martha mentioned that her daughter saved a lot of money by booking vendors 18 months in advance. Something about off-season discounts and vendor relationships. Maybe I could make some calls, see if anyone I know has connections."
It seemed like such a natural offer, a mother wanting to help with wedding planning, using whatever small social connections she might have to help her son save money. Tommy and Jennifer exchanged glances, the kind of look that said they were touched by the gesture but didn't expect much to come of it. Over the next 2 weeks, I began what I told myself was a harmless campaign of strategic assistance. I called Riverside Manor and put down a deposit using my own credit card, then called Tommy to tell him the venue had mysteriously had a cancellation for their exact date and was offering a last-minute discount that brought the price down to something they could afford. The joy in his voice when he called Jennifer to share the news should have been my first warning. Tommy wasn't just happy about getting their dream venue, he was relieved beyond measure that they wouldn't have to settle for something less. The pressure he'd been feeling to provide Jennifer with the wedding she deserved was more intense than I'd realized. "Mom, I don't know how you managed to find this deal," he said when he came over that weekend, "but you've saved our entire wedding. I was starting to think we'd have to postpone for another year just to save up enough." The gratitude in his voice was intoxicating. After years of being the mother who was helped rather than the mother who helped, I felt useful again, important, necessary in a way I hadn't experienced since Richard's illness. 2 weeks later, I orchestrated another miracle. The photographer Jennifer loved had supposedly had another last-minute cancellation and was offering a significant discount to fill the date. Then the florist I contacted happened to have over-ordered flowers for a wedding that had been postponed and could offer Jennifer's exact vision at a fraction of the original quote. With each piece of good fortune, Tommy became more animated, more excited, more grateful. He started calling me his miracle worker, joking that I had some kind of magic touch for wedding planning. Jennifer would hug me tightly whenever they came for dinner, thanking me for making their dreams possible. But something else was happening that I didn't recognize at first. With each financial pressure I secretly removed from their planning, Tommy began treating me less like his independent mother and more like his partner in creating this wedding. He started calling me multiple times a week to discuss details, asking my opinion on decisions that should have been between him and Jennifer. "What do you think about this menu option?" he'd ask, sending me photos of catering proposals. "Which band do you think would be better for dancing? Do you think we should do cocktail hour on the terrace or in the main hall?" I told myself he was including me because he was grateful for my help. But looking back, I can see that I was becoming less of a supportive mother and more of a silent financial partner whose approval felt necessary because I seemed to have magical power over wedding vendors. The shift became more obvious when Tommy started making decisions based on what he thought I would prefer rather than what he and Jennifer actually wanted. When Jennifer mentioned loving a particular style of wedding cake, Tommy would hesitate and say, "Let me check with Mom first. She might have thoughts about that." Jennifer began to look puzzled by this dynamic. During one Sunday dinner, after Tommy had deferred to me about linens and centerpieces, she pulled me aside while he was loading the dishwasher. "Catherine," she said carefully, "I really appreciate everything you're doing to help with the wedding, but I'm worried that Tommy is starting to treat this like it's your event instead of ours. I want you to be involved, but I also want us to make our own decisions." Her concern was valid, but instead of recognizing the unhealthy dynamic I was creating, I felt defensive. Here I was, secretly spending my own money to give them everything they wanted, and Jennifer was worried about too much involvement? "I'm just trying to help," I said, perhaps more sharply than necessary. "If you'd prefer to handle everything yourselves, I'm happy to step back." The hurt that flashed across Jennifer's face told me I'd responded poorly, but I was too invested in my role as secret benefactor to examine why her reasonable request had stung so much. That conversation should have been my warning that I was crossing boundaries I didn't even know existed. The conversation with Jennifer should have been my wake-up call, but instead it became the moment I doubled down on my secret involvement. I convinced myself that her concerns were just pre-wedding stress, that she didn't understand how much I was actually doing behind the scenes to make their dreams possible. If she knew the truth, that I was funding nearly everything, she would appreciate my efforts rather than questioning my involvement. But Tommy's reaction to Jennifer's request that I step back revealed something I hadn't expected to see in my son. "She doesn't understand what you've done for us," he told me privately the next day, his voice tight with frustration. "Jennifer doesn't realize how impossible this wedding would have been without your connections and help. She thinks everything just magically fell into place, but you and I know better." There was something in his tone that made me uncomfortable, a possessiveness about my involvement that seemed disproportionate to what he thought I'd contributed. Tommy believed I'd made some phone calls and found some discounts, not that I'd spent tens of thousands of dollars. Yet he was treating my role in their wedding planning as essential rather than supplementary. "Maybe Jennifer has a point," I said carefully. "This is your wedding, not mine. I don't want to overstep." Tommy's face darkened in a way I'd never seen before. "Mom, don't let her make you feel guilty for caring. You're not overstepping. You're being a good mother. Jennifer comes from money. She doesn't understand what it's like to have to work for things, to be grateful when people help you." This statement shocked me on multiple levels. First, Jennifer absolutely did not come from money. Her parents were a postal worker and a school secretary who had struggled to put her through nursing school. Second, Tommy knew this perfectly well, which meant he was deliberately mischaracterizing her background. But most disturbing was the implication that I should be grateful to be needed, that my worth as a mother was tied to my usefulness in solving their problems. "Tommy," I said slowly, "Jennifer's family isn't wealthy. You know that." He waved his hand dismissively. "She acts entitled, though, like she expects things to work out without appreciating the effort people put in to help her." I stared at my son, trying to reconcile this version of him with the grateful, hard-working man I thought I knew. The Jennifer he was describing bore no resemblance to the woman who sent me thank you notes for Sunday dinners and who worked 12-hour shifts taking care of sick children. Over the next month, Tommy's attitude toward both Jennifer and me began to shift in ways that were subtle but unmistakable. He started making comments about Jennifer's unrealistic expectations regarding wedding details, even though the expectations in question were for things I was secretly funding. When she expressed excitement about the photographer or the flowers, Tommy would respond with comments like, "Well, we're lucky Mom was able to work her magic. Otherwise, we'd be taking pictures with your cousin's iPhone." He began treating my involvement not as generous assistance, but as necessary intervention. When Jennifer suggested they handle some aspect of the planning themselves, Tommy would insist that I should stay involved because I understood how these things work in ways that Jennifer supposedly didn't. More disturbing was how he started speaking about Jennifer when she wasn't present. The woman he'd described as perfect just months earlier was now someone who didn't really understand the value of money, or who sometimes had unrealistic ideas about what we could afford. He talked about her as if she were a beautiful but impractical burden he was gallantly choosing to carry. "Sometimes I think Jennifer forgets that not everyone grows up expecting things to be handed to them," he said one evening while reviewing catering menus. "She sees what she wants and assumes it will work out, but somebody has to be the adult and figure out how to actually pay for it." I wanted to point out that Jennifer had never expected anything to be handed to her, that she'd worked through college and nursing school, that she'd been perfectly prepared to have a modest wedding within their actual budget. But Tommy seemed to have rewritten their entire financial story, casting himself as the responsible realist and Jennifer as the dreamy spendthrift. The most unsettling part was how he began to treat me as his ally in managing Jennifer's supposed financial irresponsibility. He would roll his eyes when she expressed enthusiasm about wedding details, then look at me conspiratorially, as if we shared some superior understanding of practical limitations. "Thank God I have you to help keep everything realistic," he said one afternoon while discussing reception music. "Jennifer would probably want to hire the New York Philharmonic if I let her dream without boundaries." This was particularly galling because the band Jennifer had chosen was entirely reasonable and well within the budget I was secretly providing. Tommy was creating financial constraints that didn't exist, and then positioning himself as the hero for managing them while portraying Jennifer as irresponsible for wanting things we could easily afford. I began to realize that my secret financial intervention wasn't just changing the wedding, it was changing Tommy's entire perception of himself and his relationship. Instead of seeing himself as a young man building a life with his partner, he was beginning to see himself as Jennifer's financial guardian, responsible for managing her supposedly unrealistic expectations. The dynamic became even more troubling when Tommy started making decisions about the wedding without consulting Jennifer, then justifying these decisions by referencing conversations he'd had with me. "I told the caterer we needed to stick with the chicken option," he announced one Sunday. "The beef would be too expensive, and Mom agrees that we need to be practical." Jennifer looked confused. "But I thought we decided on the beef after your mom found us that discount." "We did get a discount," Tommy said impatiently, "but that doesn't mean we should spend money carelessly. Mom understands that even with help, we need to be responsible." I watched Jennifer's face as she processed this exchange, seeing her try to understand why financial limitations that didn't seem to exist the week before were suddenly constraining her choices again. She looked at me questioningly, clearly hoping I would clarify the situation. Instead, I found myself trapped between the truth I couldn't reveal and the lie Tommy was building around my supposed involvement. The breaking point came on a Thursday evening in March, 2 months before the wedding. Tommy had called an emergency meeting at my house to discuss what he termed serious budget concerns that had supposedly emerged from the catering company. Jennifer sat on my couch looking exhausted after a double shift at the hospital, while Tommy paced my living room with spreadsheets and vendor contracts spread across the coffee table. "The bottom line is that we're going to have to make some significant cuts," Tommy announced, his tone suggesting he was delivering unavoidable bad news. "The catering costs have gone up more than expected, and we need to be realistic about what we can actually afford." I knew this was completely fabricated. I had spoken with the caterer myself that morning to confirm final headcounts, and there had been no mention of increased costs. Tommy was manufacturing a crisis for reasons I was beginning to understand with growing horror. Jennifer looked at the numbers he was showing her, her face creased with confusion. "But I thought your mother had arranged some kind of special pricing with them. Didn't they give us that discount because of her connections?" "That discount was for the basic package," Tommy said smoothly. "But you wanted upgrades, the premium bar service, the additional appetizer station, the late-night snack service. All those extras add up, and we can't expect Mom to keep finding miracle solutions every time we want something beyond our means." I watched Jennifer's face as Tommy systematically dismantled wedding elements she thought were secure, blaming her unrealistic expectations for budget problems that existed only in his imagination. She looked at me with an expression that asked for help, for clarification, for some sign that the magical solutions I'd been providing hadn't suddenly evaporated. And that's when something Richard had said to me during his final weeks came flooding back with devastating clarity. We had been sitting in his hospital room during one of his last good days, discussing our concerns about Tommy's future. Richard had been worried about something he'd observed during Tommy's childhood, a tendency to manipulate situations to avoid responsibility, a skill at rewriting narratives to make himself look like the hero or victim as circumstances required. "Catherine," Richard had said, "Tommy has a gift for making other people feel responsible for his problems. Even as a little boy, he could make his teachers feel guilty for his poor grades, make other kids feel bad for his social difficulties. It's not malicious. I think he genuinely believes his version of events, but it worries me." At the time, I had dismissed Richard's concerns as overly critical. Tommy had grown into a successful, seemingly responsible adult. Whatever manipulative tendencies he might have shown as a child had surely been outgrown. But sitting in my living room, watching my son create financial stress for his fiancée while positioning himself as the responsible party managing her supposed irresponsibility, I finally understood what Richard had been trying to warn me about. Tommy wasn't grateful for my help. He was using it. He had taken my secret financial contributions and transformed them into evidence of Jennifer's dependence on external rescue. Every vendor discount I'd arranged became proof that their wedding was only possible because of outside intervention to manage Jennifer's unrealistic expectations. Every problem I'd solved became another example of Tommy's superior financial wisdom. More disturbing was the realization that Tommy seemed to genuinely believe his own narrative. He wasn't consciously lying about Jennifer's character or their financial situation. He had convinced himself that his version of events was true. In his mind, he really was the responsible partner managing an impractical woman's expensive dreams. As I watched him explain to Jennifer why they needed to eliminate the flower arrangements she'd been looking forward to for months, I felt something I hadn't experienced since Richard's death: absolute clarity about what needed to happen next. I excused myself to go to the kitchen, ostensibly to make coffee, but actually to retrieve something I hadn't looked at in months. In the back of my desk drawer, behind old bills and forgotten paperwork, was a folder containing the quarterly statements from Patricia Hendricks's office, financial documents that showed the true scope of the resources I had access to, resources that could solve every one of Tommy's manufactured problems without me even noticing the expense. But more importantly, these documents represented something Tommy had never suspected about his mother: that the woman he was treating as a useful but limited ally in managing his fiancé's expectations was actually more financially sophisticated and capable than he could imagine. $7.2 million in carefully managed investments, real estate holdings worth another $2 million, trust funds and offshore accounts that Richard's family had established decades earlier. A financial foundation that could have bought and paid for Tommy's entire wedding venue, not just rented it for an evening. Richard's voice echoed in my memory. Make sure he earns his character before he inherits his comfort. I finally understood what my husband had been trying to tell me. The moment I saw those financial statements, everything crystallized. My son wasn't just manipulating Jennifer, he was manipulating the situation I had unknowingly created. But before I could act, I needed to understand exactly what I was dealing with. If Tommy could rewrite reality this easily with his fiancée, what else might he be capable of? That night, after Tommy and Jennifer left with their artificially constrained wedding budget, I did something I hadn't done since Richard's death. I opened my laptop and began investigating my own son. I started with the obvious: his social media accounts, his professional profile, the public records available online. What I found initially seemed to confirm the successful lawyer narrative I'd always believed. LinkedIn showed steady career progression. Facebook displayed the happy couple photos I'd expected. Instagram revealed a lifestyle that appeared appropriately modest for a young professional. But then I dug deeper. I called my friend Margaret, whose daughter worked at a different law firm in Manhattan, and asked her to discreetly inquire about Tommy's reputation in the legal community. The response came back within 2 days and left me shaken. Catherine, Margaret said carefully when she called me back, Sarah says your Tommy has quite a reputation. Brilliant lawyer, everyone agrees on that, but there are stories. He's known for taking credit for other associates' work, for charm speaking his way out of mistakes, for having a different version of events whenever something goes wrong. She said he's the kind of colleague who makes you question your own memory of conversations. This aligned too perfectly with what I was witnessing at home. The way Tommy had convinced himself that Jennifer was financially irresponsible. The way he'd reframed my assistance as necessary intervention rather than generous gift-giving. The way he consistently positioned himself as the reasonable adult managing unrealistic expectations. I decided to test something. I called the catering company directly and asked to speak with their events coordinator about Tommy's wedding. Oh, the Walsh wedding, she said brightly. Everything's all set. No changes to pricing, no additional costs. Your son did call yesterday asking about upgrades, but when I explained the costs, he said you'd need to approve any changes since you're handling the payments. My blood went cold. Tommy had told the caterer that I was paying for everything, despite the fact that he supposedly believed I'd only arranged discounts. He knew exactly who was funding his wedding, and he'd been lying to Jennifer about our financial arrangement while simultaneously lying to me about his financial constraints. I spent the next week conducting what amounted to a forensic investigation of my son's behavior. I called other vendors on their wedding list, pretending to verify details. Each conversation revealed the same pattern. Tommy had identified me as the financial source while telling Jennifer that we were stretching to afford even basic options. The photographer had a particularly eliminating conversation with me. Your son mentioned you were covering the wedding photography as a gift to them. Such a generous mother. He did ask if we could provide raw images from the engagement session we did last month, but I had to explain that our policy requires both the client and the financial guarantor to approve any additional deliverables. Engagement session? I had never heard about any engagement session, let alone paid for one. When I asked for details, I learned that Tommy had booked and paid for a premium engagement photography package 6 months earlier, a package that cost more than Jennifer's monthly salary. This was my first concrete evidence that Tommy had significantly more money available than he'd been claiming to either Jennifer or me. If he could afford luxury photography sessions, the financial constraints he kept referencing were entirely manufactured. I hired a private investigator. It felt like an extreme step, but I needed to understand who my son really was before I made any decisions about the wedding or our relationship. Within a week, I had a report that shattered every assumption I'd held about Tommy's life. The financial picture was the most shocking revelation. Tommy wasn't the struggling young lawyer I'd believed. He was earning nearly double what he'd told us. His law firm had made him a junior partner 8 months earlier, with a salary and bonus structure that put him well into 6 figures. The modest apartment he shared with Jennifer was supplemented by a luxury studio apartment in Soho that he rented under his name alone, an apartment that cost more per month than most people's salaries. But the financial deception was just the beginning. The investigator had uncovered a pattern of relationships that revealed Tommy's true character. 3 previous serious girlfriends, each of whom had broken up with him citing similar concerns: his tendency to rewrite shared experiences, his skill at making them doubt their own perceptions, his way of creating dependence while claiming to be the responsible partner managing their supposedly poor judgment. One ex-girlfriend, contacted by the investigator, had been particularly specific. Tommy has a gift for making you feel like you're crazy for wanting basic honesty. He'd tell me things that directly contradicted conversations we'd had, then act like I was being unreasonable for feeling confused. It took me months after we broke up to trust my own memory again. The picture that emerged was of a man who had perfected the art of emotional manipulation so thoroughly that he seemed to believe his own reconstructed version of events. Armed with the private investigator's report, I spent the following week in a state of controlled fury, carefully planning my next moves. The evidence was devastating, but I needed to be strategic about how I used it. Tommy had built his entire relationship with Jennifer on a foundation of lies, and simply exposing him might destroy her emotionally while allowing him to escape the consequences of his behavior. I arranged a meeting with Patricia Hendricks, my financial advisor, under the pretense of reviewing my estate planning, but my real purpose was to understand exactly what financial tools were available to me and how quickly I could deploy them if necessary. "Patricia," I said, spreading the wedding vendor contracts across her conference table, "I need to understand something about financial liability and authorization. If I've been guaranteeing payments for services but want to revoke that guarantee, what are my options?" She reviewed the documents with the thoroughness I'd come to expect from Richard's chosen advisor. "These contracts are interesting, Catherine. You're listed as the financial guarantor for all services, but the actual contracting parties are listed as Thomas Walsh and Jennifer Morrison. Legally, you could withdraw your financial backing at any time before final payment, but doing so would leave them liable for the full amounts. And if I wanted to ensure that my son couldn't use my financial backing without my explicit approval for each transaction." Patricia raised an eyebrow but answered professionally. "We could establish a specific wedding account that requires dual authorization for any withdrawals. You'd maintain ultimate control, but any access would require your signature or physical presence." That afternoon, I drove to the bank and set up exactly such an account. I transferred $200,000, enough to cover the wedding as Tommy and Jennifer understood it, but far less than I'd actually committed to spending. Every vendor payment would now require my explicit approval, giving me complete control over the financial reality of their wedding. Then I made a more decisive move. I contacted each wedding vendor and requested an in-person meeting to review final details. Over the course of 3 days, I visited the florist, the photographer, the caterer, and the venue coordinator. In each meeting, I made the same request. Any changes to services or costs should be communicated directly to me before being discussed with Tommy or Jennifer. I want to surprise them with some special touches, I explained to each vendor, but I also want to make sure we stay within our agreed budget. If my son requests any additions or modifications, please contact me first so we can discuss whether those changes fit within our overall plan. The vendors were happy to accommodate what they assumed was a generous mother wanting to ensure her son's wedding stayed organized and within budget. None of them realized I was actually creating a surveillance system that would alert me to any further manipulations Tommy might attempt. But my most important preparation was emotional. I spent hours that week reviewing the investigator's report, not just to understand the facts, but to prepare myself for the conversation I was going to have with Jennifer. She deserved to know the truth about the man she was planning to marry, but I needed to present that truth in a way that would help rather than devastate her. I also had to prepare for the possibility that Jennifer might not believe me initially. Tommy's manipulation was so sophisticated that his victims often defended him, even when presented with evidence of his deception. If Jennifer's first instinct was to protect Tommy, I needed to be ready with irrefutable proof and a clear path forward for her. The hardest part of my preparation was accepting that I might lose my relationship with Tommy entirely. Despite everything I'd discovered, he was still my son, the baby I'd raised, the boy who'd cared for his dying father, the young man I'd been so proud of. But Richard's words echoed constantly in my mind: character before comfort. My son's character was fundamentally flawed, and continuing to enable his behavior would be a disservice to everyone involved.
On Thursday evening, exactly 1 week after Tommy's manufactured budget crisis, I called Jennifer and asked if she could come over alone on Saturday afternoon. I told her I wanted to discuss some special wedding surprises I'd been planning, which was technically true, though not in the way she would expect. "Don't mention this to Tommy," I said carefully. "I want some elements of the wedding to be genuine surprises for him." Jennifer agreed enthusiastically, clearly pleased to be included in what she assumed were plans to make Tommy's day even more special. As I hung up the phone, I realized this would be the last conversation I'd have with my son's fiancé while still pretending to be the grateful, helpful mother Tommy had cast me as in his narrative. After Saturday, everything would change, for Jennifer, for Tommy, and for me. The woman Tommy thought was his useful but financially limited ally was about to become the architect of his downfall. Jennifer arrived at my house Saturday afternoon carrying a small notebook and wearing the excited expression of someone expecting to discuss flower arrangements and seating charts. She looked tired. She'd been working extra shifts to save money for their honeymoon, but her smile was genuine as she hugged me and settled into the living room where we'd had so many wedding planning conversations. "I brought my notes about the timeline for the day," she said, pulling out her carefully organized notebook. "I want to make sure I understand all the special touches you've been planning." I looked at this sweet, hard-working woman who'd been lied to for months by the man she was planning to marry, and I felt a weight of responsibility I'd never experienced before. What I was about to tell her would either free her from a lifetime of manipulation or destroy her faith in her own judgment. Either way, her life was about to change completely. "Jennifer," I said carefully, "before we talk about the wedding details, there are some things about Tommy that I need to share with you. Things I discovered recently that I believe you have a right to know." Her expression shifted immediately from excitement to concern. "Is something wrong? Is Tommy okay?" I opened the folder containing the private investigator's report and Patricia's financial documents, spreading them across the coffee table between us. "Tommy is fine, physically, but the man you're planning to marry isn't who you think he is." For the next hour, I walked Jennifer through everything I'd discovered: his real salary and the secret apartment, the pattern of manipulation with previous girlfriends, the way he'd been lying to both of us about the wedding budget while positioning himself as the responsible partner managing her supposedly unrealistic expectations, the manufactured financial crises that existed only in his narrative.
Jennifer's face went through a series of expressions: confusion, denial, recognition, and finally, a growing understanding that made my heart break for her. "But he's been so stressed about money," she said quietly, staring at the bank statements that showed Tommy's true financial situation. "He's been losing sleep over wedding costs, talking about how we need to be more realistic, more responsible." "He's been stressed about maintaining the illusion," I replied gently. "The stress wasn't about money. It was about keeping you believing that you were dependent on his financial management and my miraculous interventions." I pulled out the most damaging piece of evidence: recordings the investigator had obtained of Tommy's conversations with wedding vendors, conversations where he clearly identified me as the financial source, while simultaneously telling Jennifer we were stretching to afford basic services. As Jennifer listened to Tommy's voice casually discussing payment arrangements he'd never mentioned to her, something changed in her expression. The confusion was replaced by a clarity that was both heartbreaking and empowering to witness. "He knew," she said simply. "He knew you were paying for everything, and he let me feel guilty about the costs. He let me work double shifts to save money for a honeymoon while he was spending more than I make in a month on an apartment I didn't even know existed." "There's something else," I said, dreading this next revelation but knowing she needed to hear it. "The investigator discovered that Tommy has been telling people, colleagues, friends, some of his family, that you come from money, that your parents are wealthy, and that's how you're affording this wedding." Jennifer's face went white. "My parents are taking out a loan to afford their outfits for this wedding. My dad's been working overtime for months to pay for the rehearsal dinner we're hosting. Tommy knows this. He's been rewriting your family's financial situation the same way he's been rewriting mine," I explained. "To his colleagues, you're the privileged princess whose family money is funding your expensive tastes. To you, you're the financial burden whose unrealistic expectations require careful management." Both versions serve his narrative of being the responsible adult managing other people's poor judgment. That's when Jennifer asked the question I'd been dreading. "Mrs. Walsh, if you knew all this, if you could afford to give us this wedding without any of the stress or constraints, why didn't you just tell us the truth?" I took a deep breath, knowing my answer would reveal my own complicity in the situation. Because I wanted to see who Tommy really was when he thought no one was watching. My husband left me instructions to make sure Tommy earned his character before he inherited comfort. I thought I was testing his gratitude and responsibility. Instead, I created the perfect environment for him to reveal his true nature. Jennifer was quiet for a long moment, processing everything I'd told her. Then she looked at me with an expression I'd never seen before. Not the grateful, slightly overwhelmed young woman who'd been planning an overwhelming wedding, but a competent, intelligent person who'd finally been given the information she needed to make informed decisions. "What happens now?" she asked. "Now," I said, "you decide what you want to do with this information, and I decide what kind of mother I'm going to be moving forward." A 42-year-old man with short, dark brown hair, wearing a casual white t-shirt and dark jeans, stands in the doorway of a bright, empty living room holding cardboard moving boxes. His expression shows quiet resolve and hope for the future. Sunlight streams through large windows, illuminating the hardwood floors of his new home. His posture is confident and forward-looking, representing his fresh start after discovering the truth about his marriage. Jennifer's response surprised me with its immediate clarity. After sitting quietly for several minutes, processing everything I'd revealed, she looked up with an expression of calm determination that reminded me of myself at her age. "I need to see the apartment," she said simply. "I need to see this place he's been hiding from me, and I need to confront him there where he can't rewrite the reality I'm looking at." Within an hour, we were standing outside the luxury Soho building where Tommy maintained his secret residence. The doorman recognized Jennifer from photos Tommy had apparently shown him, greeting her warmly and mentioning how nice it was to finally meet Mr. Walsh's fiancée in person. The casual familiarity in his voice made it clear that Tommy's double life was an open secret to everyone except the woman he was supposedly building a future with. The apartment itself was a revelation that spoke louder than any financial documents could have. Designer furniture, expensive artwork, a wine collection that cost more than Jennifer's annual student loan payments. This wasn't the modest lifestyle of a young lawyer stretching to afford his dream wedding. This was the comfortable existence of someone with significant disposable income who had chosen to let his fiancée work overtime to save money for their honeymoon. Jennifer moved through the space methodically, taking photos with her phone, documenting the evidence of Tommy's deception. When she opened the closet and found designer suits that cost more than she made in a month, I watched her face harden with the recognition of how completely she'd been manipulated. "He let me buy him a wedding suit from Men's Warehouse," she said quietly. "He said we needed to be practical about clothing expenses." That's when Tommy walked in. His key turned in the lock just as Jennifer was photographing his expensive watch collection, and the shock on his face when he saw us standing in his hidden sanctuary was absolute. For perhaps the first time in his adult life, Tommy was completely unable to construct a narrative that would explain away what we were witnessing. "Jennifer," he started, his voice taking on the familiar tone of reasonable explanation, "this isn't what it looks like. I can explain everything." But Jennifer's response cut off his attempt at manipulation before it could begin. "Actually, Tommy, this is exactly what it looks like," she said, her voice steady and strong. "This is what it looks like when someone lives a double life. This is what it looks like when someone lets their partner work double shifts while they spend more on wine than she makes in a month. This is what it looks like when someone is fundamentally dishonest about who they are." Tommy's eyes darted between Jennifer and me, clearly trying to calculate how much I had revealed and what story might still salvage the situation. But for once, his gift for rewriting reality had met an immovable obstacle: photographic evidence and documented proof that couldn't be explained away. "Mom," he said, turning to me with the voice he'd used as a child when caught in misbehavior, "you don't understand the whole situation." "I understand it perfectly," I replied. "I understand that you've been lying to both of us for months while positioning yourself as the responsible adult managing everyone else's poor judgment." The conversation that followed in Tommy's secret apartment was unlike anything I'd ever experienced as a mother. For 37 years, I had watched my son navigate challenges, solve problems, and build what I believed was a life of integrity. Now I was witnessing the complete dismantling of the person I thought he was. Tommy's attempts to explain the apartment became increasingly desperate as he realized that neither Jennifer nor I were accepting his familiar patterns of justification. He tried to frame the secret residence as a practical investment, then as a surprise he'd been planning for after their marriage, then as a temporary arrangement he'd been meaning to tell Jennifer about. Each explanation contradicted the previous one, and his growing panic was evident as his usual manipulation tactics failed completely. "You're both overreacting," he said finally, falling back on the strategy that had worked so often before. "Jennifer, you know I love you. Mom, you know I'm grateful for everything you've done. We can work through this misunderstanding." But Jennifer had moved far beyond the point where Tommy's reassurances could reach her. Standing in the middle of his luxury apartment, surrounded by evidence of the wealth he'd hidden while making her feel guilty about wedding expenses, she had found a clarity that surprised even me. "Tommy," she said, removing her engagement ring and placing it on his expensive coffee table, "there's no misunderstanding here. There's just a man I don't know who's been lying to me about fundamental aspects of his life. I can't marry someone I can't trust, and I can't trust someone who's capable of this level of deception." The ring sitting on that table represented more than a broken engagement. It represented the collapse of every assumption Tommy had built his adult life around. He had expected Jennifer to accept his explanations, to defer to his superior judgment, to choose their relationship over her own perceptions. Her refusal to play the role he'd assigned her left him completely unprepared to respond. That's when I made the decision that would define our relationship going forward. "Tommy," I said, pulling out my phone and opening my banking app, "I'm canceling all payments for your wedding effective immediately. Every vendor will receive notice today that their financial guarantee has been withdrawn." His face went white as the implications sank in. Without my financial backing, he was personally liable for hundreds of thousands of dollars in wedding expenses, expenses he could afford with his real income, but which would require him to reveal the truth about his financial situation to everyone involved. "Mom, you can't do this," he said, his voice taking on a pleading quality I'd never heard before. "The wedding is in 2 months. The deposits alone will bankrupt me if you pull out now." "You won't be bankrupted," I replied calmly. "You'll just have to pay for your own wedding with your own money, like the adult you've been pretending to be." For the first time in our conversation, Tommy's mask completely slipped. Gone was the charming, reasonable man who'd been trying to manage the situation. What remained was someone who looked genuinely frightened by the prospect of facing the real consequences of his choices. "What am I supposed to tell people?" he asked desperately. "The truth," Jennifer said simply. "Try telling people the truth for once." 8 months later, I sat in my garden on a crisp October morning, drinking coffee and reading a letter that had arrived the day before. The return address was from a small apartment in Queens, Jennifer's new address, far from the Manhattan life she'd been building with Tommy. "Dear Catherine," the letter began, in Jennifer's careful handwriting, "I wanted to update you on how things have been going and to thank you again for having the courage to tell me the truth when it mattered most." The letter went on to describe the life Jennifer had built since calling off the wedding. She'd left the pediatric hospital where she'd worked during her relationship with Tommy, too many memories, she explained, and had taken a position at a community health clinic in Queens. The work was more challenging, the pay slightly less, but she felt fulfilled in ways she hadn't experienced during her years of trying to build a life around Tommy's carefully constructed illusions. "I've been going to therapy," she wrote, "trying to understand how I allowed myself to doubt my own perceptions for so long. My therapist says it's common for people in manipulative relationships to lose confidence in their own judgment. I'm slowly learning to trust myself again." She'd also met someone new, a fellow nurse named David who was everything Tommy had pretended to be. Honest about his finances, transparent about his living situation, and supportive of Jennifer's independence rather than threatened by it. They were taking things slowly, Jennifer wrote, building trust carefully after her experience with deception. "The strangest thing," her letter continued, "is that I'm actually grateful for what happened, not for the pain, but for learning who I really am when I'm not trying to accommodate someone else's version of reality. I'm stronger than I thought I was." As for Tommy, the aftermath of the canceled wedding had been as devastating as I'd expected. When vendors began demanding immediate payment for services that were no longer needed, his true financial situation became public knowledge among his social circle. His law firm's partners learned about his deceptive personal behavior, which led to questions about his professional integrity. Within 3 months, he'd been quietly asked to resign. He'd tried to contact me several times in the weeks following the confrontation, alternating between angry demands that I restore his wedding funding and tearful apologies for his behavior. But each conversation revealed that he still didn't understand the fundamental problem. He continued to believe that his manipulation was justified by his good intentions, that his lies were reasonable responses to other people's unrealistic expectations. The last time we spoke, 6 months after the canceled wedding, Tommy had called to tell me he was moving to Los Angeles to start over. He'd found a position with a smaller firm, he said, and felt he needed distance from New York and the complications that had developed there. "I hope someday you'll understand that I never meant to hurt anyone," he said before hanging up. "I was just trying to make everyone happy." Even then, he couldn't acknowledge that his version of making people happy had required systematic deception and emotional manipulation. The $7.2 million that Richard had left me remained untouched, managed conservatively by Patricia Hendricks, growing quietly while I decided how to honor my husband's original intentions for our family's wealth. That October morning, finishing Jennifer's letter in my garden, I understood something about motherhood that had taken me 64 years to learn. Sometimes, the greatest gift you can give someone you love is the chance to face the consequences of their choices, even when those consequences are painful. Richard's instruction to ensure Tommy earned his character before inheriting comfort had seemed like wisdom when he wrote it, but I had misunderstood what it meant. I thought character was something I could test with the right circumstances, something I could measure and then reward. What I learned was that character isn't earned through tests, it's revealed through choices, and some people will consistently choose manipulation over honesty, control over connection, personal advantage over integrity. The money that was supposed to be Tommy's inheritance sits in carefully managed accounts, growing steadily under Patricia's guidance, but its destination has changed. Instead of funding the comfortable life of a son who never learned to value truth over convenience, it will eventually support causes that help people recognize and escape from emotional manipulation, the kind of systematic deception that Tommy had perfected and that Jennifer had survived. I've started volunteering at a center for victims of domestic abuse, where I help women who've experienced the same gradual erosion of self-trust that I witnessed in Jennifer's relationship with my son. The stories are remarkably similar. Partners who rewrite shared experiences, who create artificial crises to position themselves as heroes, who systematically undermine their victims' confidence in their own perceptions. The hardest part, one woman told me during a support group session, isn't recovering from what he did. It's learning to trust my own memory again, to believe that what I experienced was real even when he told me it wasn't. These conversations have helped me understand that what I witnessed in Tommy wasn't a character flaw that could be corrected with the right incentives or consequences. It was a fundamental approach to relationships that treated other people as resources to be managed rather than individuals to be respected. The $500,000 I had planned to spend on his wedding has been donated to organizations that provide legal assistance to victims of financial abuse. It feels appropriate that money meant to celebrate a relationship built on deception is now helping people escape similar situations. But perhaps the most important thing I've learned is this: love without boundaries isn't kindness, it's enabling. For years, I thought being a good mother meant protecting Tommy from consequences, smoothing his path, providing resources that would make his life easier. What I should have been teaching him was that relationships require honesty, that trust must be earned through consistent behavior, and that other people's feelings and perceptions matter as much as his own. Every Sunday, I call Jennifer to check on her progress, to share stories about our weeks, and to maintain the relationship that began in deception but has grown into genuine friendship. She represents the daughter I never had and the woman I hope I would have become if I'd learned earlier to trust my own judgment over other people's convenient explanations. The greatest lesson of my 64 years is this: sometimes the people we love most need us to stop helping them avoid reality. And sometimes the most loving thing we can do is step back and let the truth reveal itself, no matter how painful that truth might be.
Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.